Is it possible that you create your reality? Is one of the most useful and transformative ideas you've ever encountered, and one of the most quietly damaging. This is Wisdom versus Wallpaper. I'm Allen Kerber. You start hearing it from different directions, and it reinforces itself. Think and Grow Rich, The Secret, Energy Flows Where Attention Goes, and so on. The phrasing shifts, but the idea underneath stays consistent enough that it starts to feel like a shared foundation of kind of a hidden rule of the universe that unlocks how to function fully and deliberately. And dependable, like it's gravity. It's just how things really work. It is an idea that has come to explain a great deal. And if you pull on that thread, you run into people who shaped it. Napoleon Hill ties it to achievement. Louise Hay brings it into healing. Wayne Dyer gives it a broader philosophical tone. Neville Goddard leans into imagination. Abraham Hicks centers it around alignment. And Joe Dispenza connects it to the brain and measurable change. And there are many others, each person adding something useful, but each one shaped it also in their own way. And if you spend enough time with any one of those perspectives, it can feel like you've got something solid. There's enough there to work with. Enough to explain certain experiences and to start making real changes in your life and in the world around you. Now that's the part worth slowing down for. Not whether these ideas have value, but what happens when something that started as one part of a much larger framework gets treated as if it explains the whole thing? What makes this idea so difficult to step back from is that it doesn't arrive as pressure, it arrives as relief. There's something deeply compelling about being told that your inner world carries that kind of influence, that your thoughts are not just reactions to what's happening, but part of what shapes what happens next. It gives you somewhere to stand. It gives you a place to begin. In a world where a lot of things feel outside your control, that lands with real force. And because it lands that way, it doesn't get examined very closely. It gets adopted and it gets repeated, and it starts to feel like a foundation you can build on. The idea doesn't change. The way it's used does. It stops being something that might influence certain parts of your life and starts to take on a broader role. It becomes a way of explaining why things happen at all. At that point, it's carrying way more than it was originally meant to hold. And that changes the terms. Experiences that would normally be taken at face value start to get filtered through this lens, not just the outcomes you want, but the ones you didn't. Not just the moments of clarity, but moments of confusion or stress or pain. And there isn't much space for complexity or for contradiction. There is an allowance for the parts of life that don't respond in a direct or predictable way. Those don't disappear, they just become harder to account for. And when there isn't a clear way to account for them, attention tends to move in a familiar direction, which is back toward the self, back toward how something is being held or interpreted or approached internally. Now that's where the weight really begins to shift, not because the idea itself demands it outright, but because there aren't really many other places to go. Where's that weight going to go? Once it's being used as a general explanation, that's the part that tends to stay in the background, not whether the idea works in certain situations, but what happens when it's asked to explain everything. Once that line is crossed, the way people relate to their own experiences starts to change. And that's where it makes sense to step back and look at how this way of thinking developed in the first place. These ideas didn't appear fully formed. They came out of a very specific time in a very specific place, shaped by a set of conditions that are easy to miss when you only see the modern versions. If you go back to the early roots of what is now called New Thought, you don't find polished systems or clean, repeatable formulas. You find something much more experimental. People trying to understand the relationship between the mind and the body, trying to make sense of how belief and attention and expectation might influence physical experience. It sat somewhere between philosophy, early psychology, and a kind of spiritual inquiry that didn't have clear boundaries yet. Phineas Quimby is often pointed to as one of the starting points in the early 1800s, not because he laid out a system that people could follow step by step, but because he was working with an idea that felt totally radical at the time. That the way a person thinks, the way they interpret their condition, could have a direct impact on how that condition unfolds. That idea didn't stay contained, it moved. And as it moved, it started to take on new shapes. It intersected with religious thought. It picked up elements of Protestant work ethic, where effort and outcome were already closely linked. It blended with a cultural belief in self-determination, especially in the United States, where the idea that you could shape your own future was already deeply embedded in part of a growing national identity. By the time it started to show up in more structured forms, it was no longer just an exploration. It was becoming something people could use, something that could be taught, repeated, and passed along. And that's where the next shift happens. Because once an idea becomes teachable, it also becomes transferable. It can move from one context to another without bringing everything that originally surrounded it. And that's where simplification begins. Not necessarily as a flaw, but as a function of scale. The clearer and more direct an idea becomes, the easier it is to spread. The easier it is to spread, the more it risks losing the conditions that gave it depth in the first place. That tension runs through everything that came after. What we're working with now isn't the original version. It's what those ideas became as they passed through different people, different intentions, a culture eager to make them practical. That's what you see when you follow the lineage in motion. Once those ideas started moving, they didn't just spread, they adapted to the people carrying them. You can see that clearly when you follow how they show up in different voices over time. It's like with someone like Napoleon Hill. The emphasis narrows in a very particular direction. The question becomes what you can achieve, what you can produce, what you can direct your thinking toward in order to get a specific result. There's a confidence in the idea that if you understand the mechanism well enough, you could apply it deliberately. Thought becomes a lever, something you can use. That framing doesn't disappear, it shifts. Louise Hay takes that same underlying premise and turns it inward. The focus moves away from external success and toward the body, toward healing, toward the idea that the way you think about yourself, the way you interpret what's happening internally, has a direct relationship to your physical condition. The scale changes but the structure is still there. What happens on the inside, shaping what happens on the outside. Wayne Dyer softens the edges of it. There's less emphasis on application, more on perspective. The tone becomes reflective, less about directing outcomes and more about how you understand your place within them. It opens the door a little wider, makes the idea easier to live with, not just work with. Then Neville Goddard takes it somewhere else entirely. Imagination becomes central, not just as a tool, but as the place where reality is formed before it shows up in any visible way. It's not about adjusting your thinking in response to what's happening. It's about inhabiting a state that assumes something has already happened and allowing everything else to follow from that. That thread continues into Abraham Hicks, where the language shifts again. The emphasis moves towards alignment, toward the state you're holding consistently, the way your emotional tone is maintained over time. The details of individual thoughts matter less than the overall condition you're in. It's something you're meant to stay in, not just reach for. And then you get to Joe Dispenza, and suddenly the conversation sounds technical. You hear about neural pathways, conditioning, measurable change. The same underlying idea is now presented in a way that feels grounded in something observable, something that can be practiced, repeated, tracked. What's consistent through all of this isn't the language, it's the direction. Each of these perspectives is working with the same central premise, but each one is emphasizing a different part of it. Thought, belief, imagination, state, conditioning. None of them are wrong in isolation. Each one points to something real, but none of them are holding the whole structure at once. And that's easy to miss when you're encountering them one at a time. What most people experience is not one of these systems in isolation, but a gradual exposure to all of them. An idea that resonates here, a concept that explains something there, and a framework that feels useful in a particular moment. It builds over time, often without much attention to how those pieces relate to each other. So the result isn't a single integrated system. It's something assembled, cobbled together. And because the core idea underneath it feels consistent, that assembly doesn't feel unstable. It feels reinforced. Each new perspective seems to confirm the same underlying assumption that your internal state has a direct relationship to what unfolds externally. That if you can understand and direct that state, you can influence outcomes in a meaningful way. By the time these ideas settle into the culture, they are no longer moving the way they did at the beginning. They're not being explored in small circles or worked through in a contained setting where someone can test them against experience and see where they hold and where they don't. They've already been simplified enough to travel, and once that happens, they start interacting with whatever environment they land in. In the United States, that environment has a strong bias towards effort, outcome, personal responsibility, the long-standing assumption that if you apply yourself correctly, you should see a result. That way of thinking shows up in work, in education, in identity. It's tied to the idea that you can shape your future if you do the right things in the right way, a long-standing cultural promise that effort should lead to outcome. When a philosophy that emphasizes the power of the mind moves into that environment, it doesn't stay separate from it. It starts to merge with it, often without anyone consciously deciding that's what's happening. The language still sounds expansive, still points to awareness and possibility, But the way it's used begins to take on the tone of something much more familiar. It starts to sound like a process you can get better at, like something that can be done correctly or incorrectly. And once it takes on that shape, it begins to feel like something you can be measured against, even if no one is explicitly keeping score. That's where you start to feel the shift. It's no longer just something you think about. It becomes something you have to manage. You stop simply noticing your thoughts and start trying to control them, keeping them in the right range so things turn out the way you want. You start paying attention to how you're thinking, how you're feeling, how you're responding, not just out of curiosity, but with the sense that it needs to stay within a certain range if you want things to move in the direction you've been told they can. That's not something that happens all at once. It builds gradually, reinforced by the same ideas showing up from multiple directions. The more often you hear that your internal state shapes what happens externally, the more natural it becomes to apply that idea across situations, even ones that don't fit neatly inside. So when things go well, the connection feels obvious. It's easy to point back to a shift in thinking, a change in focus, a different way of approaching something. That reinforces the idea without much resistance. When things don't go well, the process doesn't change direction. The attention still turns inward because that's where the framework has taught you to look. There isn't a built-in way to account for everything that might be influencing the situation, so the explanation narrows to what you can access directly. Over time, that starts to shape the way experience is interpreted more broadly. Situations that would normally be taken as complex start to feel like they should have a clear internal cause. Emotions that would otherwise be part of a natural response begin to feel like they need to be adjusted or redirected. There's a quiet pressure to keep everything within that certain range so you can get the outcomes you want. At first, it doesn't even feel like pressure. It can feel like commitment or discipline or simply taking responsibility for your life. Those are all values that are already reinforced culturally, so the transition doesn't feel foreign. But the longer that approach is sustained, the more it begins to narrow the way experience is allowed to unfold. There's less room for things that don't resolve cleanly, less room for reactions that don't fit the model, or for the possibility that something can happen without it being traceable to a specific internal condition. I made a short exercise around this called the Pressure Audit, because most people can't tell whether they're exhausted from life or from the invisible rules they've been living under. It's free on wisdomvswallpaper.com if you want to work through it. Once that way of thinking settles in, it doesn't stay abstract for very long. It starts to show up in ordinary situations, in small moments where nothing about the experience feels philosophical, but the interpretation still runs through that same lens. Someone gets sick, and instead of starting with what's happening physically, there is a quiet question about what might be out of alignment. Not because they're naive, because the framework has trained that question to be the first one. A relationship shifts or ends, and alongside whatever is actually being felt, there's a layer of interpretation trying to understand what was created or attracted. Even something as simple as feeling overwhelmed can take on a different tone, as if the feeling itself needs to be corrected before anything else can be addressed. You still feel what you feel, but now there's a second thing running alongside it, trying to make sense of everything in terms of what you were thinking or holding internally. At first, it can actually feel like you're being attentive, like you're taking responsibility. That's part of what makes it hard to notice. But over time, it starts to shape the way experience is handled more broadly. It becomes harder to leave something as it is, even temporarily. There's a pull to interpret it, to understand what it means in terms of what was held internally and what was focused on and what might need to be adjusted. That pull doesn't always feel forced. It can feel like engagement. A responsible, active way of working with your life. At some point, you stop being with your experience and start policing it. There's less space to let something unfold without stepping in. You find yourself trying to fix or reinterpret every emotion or thought process before it's even had a chance to be there and unfold. That's where the weight becomes more noticeable because the range of acceptable responses starts to narrow. Certain emotions feel like they need to be redirected. Situations feel like they need to be resolved quickly, or at least understood in a way that restores a sense of order. When that becomes the default, it affects how people relate to themselves in a way that are easy to miss. There can be a quiet distance from parts of their own experience that don't fit, a tendency to move past something before it's been fully registered, a habit of translating what's happening into a form that makes it easier to work with, even if that translation leaves something out. It doesn't mean the original experience disappears. It means it gets filtered. And once that filtering becomes consistent, it could start to feel like that's just how things are supposed to be handled. That's usually where the strain shows up. Even if it's hard to name directly, something about the process feels tight. Like there isn't quite enough room for everything that's happening to be included as it is. Like part of the experience is always being adjusted to fit a framework that doesn't quite account for it. That's not the person's fault. It's just that the idea is asked to do more than it was ever meant to do. When you step back and look at all of this together, the pattern starts to come into focus. An idea that carries real insight begins in a specific context. It moves through different people, each of whom brings out a different aspect of it. Over time, it spreads far enough that most people encounter it in pieces rather than as a whole. Those pieces still work in situations. They still shift how people think, how they respond, what they notice. That part doesn't disappear. What changes is the role those ideas are asked to play. They move from being part of a larger way of understanding experience to becoming a primary explanation for it. And once that happens, the pressure that builds around them starts to make more sense. It isn't just coming from the ideas themselves. It's coming from the gap between what those ideas can actually account for and what they're being used to explain. That gap doesn't show up when things are simple or when outcomes line up cleanly. It shows up in the moments that carry more weight, the ones that involve other people, timing, history, systems, things that don't move in a straight line. Those are the moments that tend to expose the limits of a simplified framework. Not because the framework has no value, but because it's being stretched beyond what it was built to hold. So, what would it look like to use those ideas without being used by them? That's where something different becomes helpful. Not another belief system to layer on top. Not a brand new method to replace the old one. Something simpler and more grounded. A way of working with your thinking that doesn't ask one idea to explain everything. A way of meeting your experience that allows it to be complicated without forcing it to make sense immediately. That's the direction internal design moves in. It doesn't replace these ideas. It puts them back into proportion. It helps you use those ideas without asking them to explain your entire life. And when that shift happens, the same concepts that once felt like pressure become useful tools again, something you can pick up when they fit and set down when they don't. When you see it that way, nothing in this needs to be thrown out. It just needs to be put back in proportion. The mind has influence. That's real. It's just not the only thing at work. And once you stop asking it to explain everything, it becomes a lot more useful. You can work with it instead of working against yourself. This is Wisdom versus Wallpaper. I'm Kevin Allen Kerber. Hey, if this episode gave language to something you've been carrying, follow the show. That helps more than people realize, and it helps more of the right people find this work. Because wisdom isn't wallpaper, and you shouldn't have to live with the pressure of pretending it is. And if you want the practical side of this, the tools and deeper work live at wisdomvswallpaper.com.